Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at some pretty interesting hardware, and by interesting I mean more like nostalgic. So today we're going to be going sort of back down on a trip down memory lane, at least for me personally, since what we're going to be taking a look at today is one of the first GPUs, or I should say sort of high-end-ish GPUs I ever owned. It was actually more considered mid-range back when it launched, but I'll be getting into the specs and stuff of it in just a moment once when we take a look at the card itself before we go and run down some benchmarks. But of course, today you're probably wondering, well, unless I put it in the title, of course, what are you looking at? What are you looking at, dude? Well, today we're going to be taking a look at the Radeon HD 6850. This is a fairly mid-tier GPU, at least it was when it launched. You can typically find it selling used for between $50 and $35. That's where I'm seeing it kind of trending right now on eBay. Back in the day of Battlefield 3 and when that was like the big hot game to be playing, and basically back when I was getting into playing games on PC versus console, when I was moving from the Xbox 360 to PC, this was the GPU that I bought to replace the crappy one that my pre-built system came with. Also, another project I've been thinking of doing perhaps is rebuilding that PC, just to see how it does in modern titles and stuff like that, because I do still have pretty much all of the components stashed away. For today, we're going to be focusing on this GPU, and a few things that I wanted to just sort of note about this card is that it clearly still has that sort of like almost space age like aesthetic that it seems like older GPUs and GPUs around this time period really liked to hold on to, where they kind of have these tacky like stickers and stuff like that don't look very good. As far as this, like the heatsink shroud is concerned, it honestly still sort of follows Gigabyte's WindForce style. Obviously the style has evolved over time, but for the most part it definitely retains that same aesthetic. It has a blue PCB, which I gotta say doesn't look super great. I've gotten really accustomed to black PCBs, so green and blue and stuff like that just really doesn't look that good in this day and age. But obviously, you know, if you're buying a used card like this that's this old, you're probably not buying it for the aesthetics. One thing I do really like, and I wish was more prominent on modern GPUs, is how the 6-pin power connector comes out the back of the card instead of on the side. I mean, I can understand in certain builds how that would be problematic, but in most of the builds I've ever done, if this had just come off the back of the PCB, that would be really nice because you can sort of hide away the cable a little bit easier. But I could understand how in some cases that could sort of conflict with other things on your board. So regardless, I do really like how it comes out the back. It looks really clean in my opinion, but then again, that's, you know, something, it's a pretty minor little thing, but to be fair, the rest of this card is pretty damn ugly. But of course, like I said, if you're buying a used GPU like this, perhaps for a performance-friendly or budget-friendly build with some decent performance, you probably don't give a damn about the aesthetics. And to be fair, most of these 6850s that I'm finding on eBay and stuff like that aren't even like this model, and there are better looking versions of this from different vendors and stuff like that. For the tests that we're going to be doing today, this card will do just fine and will give us a decent idea of you know, what kind of performance you can expect from any card bearing the 6850 chip on board. So one last thing before we jump into the benchmarks and some of the stuff that's more specific about this GPU. Back in the day when Battlefield 3 was the big thing, that was what I purchased this card for, because I was going from Radeon HD 5450, which is a tiny card. I still have that GPU as well, so if perhaps we want to go and throw that through some benchmarks, it's gonna fail horribly. But I bought this GPU at around $150 because I was hoping to, you know, be able to max out Battlefield 3 back in the day. And I do remember it doing that. I don't remember how well it did that, because that was back before I even paid attention to like frame rate and frame times and all that stupid stuff. So I was kind of just like, wow, if I can get above 30 FPS on Ultra, then I won. So we're going to be testing Battlefield 3 as well today, even though obviously that is a pretty dated title at this point. We'll be throwing it against some other DirectX DirectX 11 benchmarks as well, due to the fact that this card only has maximum support for DirectX 11. But we're going to see how this thing sort of handles games at like 1080p and perhaps a little bit sub 1080p depending on how hard it struggles. And of course, assuming that it actually still works, because it's been a couple months since I tried firing it up. If it still functions well, we're going to be pairing it up with my system back there, which I'll get into in just a moment. But that's what we're going to be doing, slapping on the newest drivers, if there are anything even really all that recent for this card, and we're going to be throwing some benchmarks at it and seeing how this beautiful little, like, roughly $35 GPU does in this day and age. Now for today, I decided to run 2 synthetics and then play 4 games to sort of get a general idea of how this GPU handles modern-ish titles. Obviously, one of the titles that I'm going to mention in a moment is not modern, but I wanted to sort of have a little bit of a throwback to what I used to use this GPU for when I first bought it. Now, for the 2 synthetic benchmarks I ran Firestrike, the standard edition, and Superposition on the 1080p medium preset. For starters, Superposition, while it did run, there was a little bit of some weird stuff going on because apparently AMD's driver suite installs a bunch of extra crap that kept trying to launch in the background and kept crashing the benchmark. But once I got the benchmark to run through stable and got all those stupid background processes shut down, the benchmark averaged around 14 FPS, around 14 FPS. I'll obviously put the slide up with all the results and things, but which is, I mean, honestly a lot better than I expected considering how old this GPU is. But then again, I guess it is just sort of a testament to how well it still runs despite its age, despite the fact that Fire Strike is significantly older is a bit of a different story. Now with the free version of Fire Strike, you can't really configure anything, unfortunately, so I can't see exactly what it's running at. I didn't even bother having it complete the benchmark run because when the results were basically unplayable, it averaged around 9 FPS. Not going to put up that slide because I didn't even bother finishing that benchmark, because in my opinion that's far from actually usable. Now on to the actual gameplay scenarios. I tested 4 games like I mentioned. I tested Battlefield 3, Overwatch, Battlegrounds, and Star Wars Battlefront 2, as in the original Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now BF3, we'll start off with that just because I decided I wanted to test that to see, like, hey, what was I considering to be playable FPS back in the day when I used the card. Now of course these are newer drivers. Of course this current driver that I was running with the 6850 actually was published I believe May of last year, so it is still old, but obviously they're not really updating the drivers anymore, as it is pretty much an obsolete card at this point. So for Battlefield 3, I tested a whole variety of settings. Now I do remember when I was playing it on this card, I was always maxing it out outside of fucking MSAA or whatever, because that just completely hammered the card to being completely unplayable. But then again, as I'm about to get into, you're about to find out that apparently these averages that I, played with back in the day, I wouldn't really consider them playable anymore. So for starters, with Ultra, with MSAA off, 16 times anthroposcopic filtering, or however you pronounce that word, and ambient occlusion enabled, we averaged out at 37 FPS. For the medium preset, we hit 53 FPS average, which is okay. I would consider it fairly playable. It felt relatively smooth. There wasn't actually any huge amount of stuttering, so that was good. For the low preset, we only gained 2 FPS average, which seemed a little bit interesting, but it averaged out at 55 FPS. And all of these tests were conducted on a 64-player server on the No Shower Canals TDM, so obviously there's a ton of crazy shit going on all the time. So this is kind of like a worst-case scenario for the GPU, where everything's very compact and just hectic in one spot. And of course all tests were conducted at 1080p resolution native, no like resolution scaling or anything like that. Of course there was some implemented in a couple of the other games that I'll talk about here in a moment, but for the most part, I don't understand how I was able to play this game at 37 FPS average back in the day on ultra settings. But hey, I did it. Now, of course, if you're going to try and go play Battlefield 3 on this currently today, I would suggest, if you're going to try and play at 1080p, obviously lower everything down. I mean, I could have dropped off AO and AF to like being completely disabled and it would have been fine. Probably would have broken 60 FPS in that case, but I didn't. So regardless, 55 FPS, while it isn't a steady 60, is actually fairly playable, and in the experience that I had playing a few matches on No Shower Canals, it felt pretty smooth. Now we're moving on to Overwatch with the medium preset with 100% resolution scaling. We averaged 67 FPS throughout the course of the match that I played, and it was a fairly hectic match. There was a pretty good variety of stuff going on, but for the most part the game felt pretty playable. I will say, however, there seemed to be some sort of like input latency, but I'm not sure if that had anything to do with the GPU, but I haven't experienced that with other GPUs that I've used with this game, so that is just something to keep in mind. It feels like there's like your input's a little bit delayed, but that could have just been an issue with settings or something like that, as I've never experienced this with any other card, and I didn't experience it with any of the other games that I tested. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was pretty much unplayable, to be fair, understandably so, considering that game is currently very poorly optimized and in early access, and not to mention that it just came out, so we're throwing something brand new at a card that's many years old at this point. Battlegrounds with the very low preset at 1080p with 70% resolution scaling, so technically it's being internally rendered at sub 1080p, averaged 19 FPS through the course of the match that I played. So quite frankly, not particularly good. And then to throw things back, once again, we go back to Star Wars Battlefront 2. I have one mod installed that fixes some bugs and ups a few quality, like graphical quality things. But for the most part, this is the kind of vanilla performance that you could expect. This game does have an 80 FPS limit, basically. It just never goes higher than that. There may be a way to unlock that, but I did not bother for this test. So with all settings maxed out and including the instant action match that I played, I had the maximum number of AI that I could have on the map at one time. It averaged 80 FPS. Whoa, wow, it never felt like it dipped below 80 FPS. What a surprise, said no one ever. So then, at the end of this all, what what would I say is the verdict on this GPU? Back in the day, the Radeon HD 6850 kicked some serious ass for $150. I'd have to do some research to see if that was exactly the launch price, but that is what I purchased it for back when CompUSA still existed. I went into CompUSA after doing some research, and I found this bad boy for $150. To me, from going from the HD 5450 with 500 megs of VRAM, this was a massive upgrade in pretty much every department. Now, would I recommend anyone purchase this card today? That's a little bit of a different story. Obviously, this card does not have DirectX 12 support, as it is extremely old. It does have full DirectX 11 support, so most titles will run perfectly fine on it, despite the fact that it is, like I just said, old. It only has 1 gig of VRAM, which is definitely a limiting factor. I remember when I was setting up the superposition benchmark, I received a warning before running the benchmark that perhaps this GPU is not good enough and that it could crash, as the little estimator bar thing that tells you how much VRAM it's supposedly going to use was technically maxed out, and it was saying it was going to use about 200 megs of VRAM more than this card actually has. But of course, for all the titles that I tested, and for like say esports titles that aren't quite as graphically demanding, I do remember playing CSGO back in the day on this and it running perfectly fine, I will say that. But even for like Overwatch, if you are willing to sacrifice some visual fidelity, then you can very easily maintain 60 FPS at 1080p, full native 1080p, not with any stupid scaling going on. And considering that this GPU runs about $35 on the used market, like $35 to $50-ish depending on the model you get, which obviously depending on the model there's different coolers on it, or they have slightly different boost clocks and stuff like that out of the box. So depending on how much you want to spend on it, I would shoot for somewhere between $35 and $40, because if you can pick this GPU up for that or less, this is honestly like one of the best budget GPUs on the market at the moment. Now, of course, it does have its limitations, like I said, but if you're going for perhaps like a really cheap sub $500 budget build, then this is definitely a GPU to look out for. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm actually, hold up, give me a hot second here to set this down, because I've got another thing that I could test in the near future. Right here, this is my second GPU upgrade that I got. This is still a gigabyte card. It still has the WindForce form factor, which apparently I got really addicted to because I bought all WindForce cards up until this point just conveniently because it's worked out that way. But anyways, so this is my second GPU upgrade. This is a Gigabyte WindForce GTX 760. This is when I moved over to NVIDIA, and I've been with NVIDIA ever since. But if you would like me to perhaps slap this in the build behind me and see how the 760 performs in today's titles, obviously this thing it's a pretty big upgrade from the 6850. So if you would like to see how this card performs in modern titles and stuff like that, and perhaps maybe run some of the same tests, do some comparisons, stuff like that, then let me know in the comment section down below this video. Anyways, thanks again for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.